Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Our forum is free and open to the public, and we hope that you'll consider coming. To find out more about our Public Affairs Forum, you can go to our website at austinuu.org. And now I'm going to introduce Dale Beulah, who will in turn introduce our speaker this morning, Karl Rabago.
Karl Rabago is the electric transportation and clean energy utility guy. If you're interested in solar and wind and electric vehicles and reducing our carbon footprint, Karl is the guy. He's the Vice President of Distributed Energy for Austin Energy, and he leads the utilities energy efficiency, green building, and climate change program. I could go with a lot more information, but we'd rather hear him than listen to me. So, Karl Rabago, would you come up and turn us on?
What I want to do today is to give you a little, well, let me put it this way. If you read the news in Austin these days, you probably see that they were going through this rate review. And just prior to this, we were going through a resource plan, and probably if you're paying any attention at all, at one point or another, the question that comes up in your mind is something like, what are they thinking? I have no idea. It's a big organization. It's got thousands of people in it. But I thought it might be helpful if I gave you some insight, at least into what one group that I get the opportunity and honor to lead, how we're thinking. And I want to explain to you how we're thinking about electric transportation. Because in a nutshell, we think it's inevitable. We think the electrification of the personal transportation sector is inevitable. We will get off of petroleum eventually, and hopefully we'll get off of it sooner rather than later. I'm not going to go through all the political background about why it's a good idea for us to stop sending money overseas to the same countries that use that money to fund terrorism and things like that against us. You can figure that out yourself. Read the op-eds and all the news about that. I am also, by the way, not going to get into a big discussion about why we can't solve the problem by going to pristine wilderness in places like Alaska and destroying the environment and the habitat there to get a few, maybe years worth of petroleum out of them. That's another discussion. And I'm not going to get into a debate about why one of the fundamental reasons we need to get off fossil fuels is that we're destroying the very atmosphere and climate upon which we all depend. If you don't believe in the science about climate change, from a scientific point of view, you're wrong. And it's sort of beyond debate now. We know we're changing the atmosphere for the worse, and we have to do something about it. And even if there's a tiny percentage risk that we're not wrong, it's the right thing to do. That we're not right about it, that we are wrong and that we're not changing the climate. It's the right thing to do. It's from a stewardship point of view, from any number of moral, philosophical, ethical, and even religious reasons. So, with all that, I'm going to tell you about why your electric utility, if you're an Austin Energy customer, is thinking about and working really hard to get into the electric vehicle space. It starts with our mission statement. Our mission statement is clean, affordable, and reliable electric service. Clean, affordable, reliable, and I think it's an excellent customer service. The thing that's important about our definition, our mission, is that it says it's clean, affordable, and reliable. It doesn't say we're going to be clean or affordable, or clean or reliable. We have to do all three at the same time. And it's also important to note that Austin Energy's mission statement, at least as we read it, doesn't have a time element to it. It says tomorrow. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say today but not tomorrow. It doesn't have a time element. We have to do it all the time, which means that the decisions and the actions we undertake today should work today and should work tomorrow as well. And if you put all that together, right, meeting the goals of people and the planet and economic responsibility and doing it today and doing it tomorrow, you come pretty close to a definition of sustainable development. Those sustainability-type goals that Austin Energy lives under, which are enhanced and strengthened and actually formally driven by our City Council's objectives, starting many, many years back, but most recently really strongly stated in the Climate Protection Plan that they adopted in 2007, say, and then modified recently, say that we're going to get to at least a third of our electricity coming from renewable resources by 2020. We're going to build not our first, but our second conservation power plant, meaning that in lieu of building a big coal-burning or gas-burning power plant, we will build a power plant made out of savings. And by saving as much energy as a power plant would generate, we'll actually generate huge benefits to all customers and the environment and to basically the economics of the utility and the community. So we're going to build our second one, 800 megawatts by 2020. And we're going to do a number of other things as well. So that's our charter. We're supposed to be the most climate responsible utility in the country. We're supposed to be a leader for everyone else. We're supposed to demonstrate it with a substantial fraction of our generation coming from renewables by 2020. We're supposed to build a second conservation power plant. And we want to do everything we possibly can and use every possible tool in the books to get there. So, and some that haven't been invented yet, or at least perfected. So, that's the mission, that's the challenge. The issue comes up, well, are there problems? And there are problems. There are challenges associated with doing that. Today, for example, the most economic way to get to a high percentage of renewable energy is to buy wind. Wind is much cheaper than natural gas. It's much cheaper than coal. It's far cheaper than nuclear. It's abundant in West Texas. Getting a lot of wind is a great idea. The problem with wind in West Texas, however, is that it peaks at night. And it peaks at a time when that is not in sync with the load that all of us impose on the utility. And you know from your own personal experience that the way we use electricity is most intense around 4 p.m., especially on a summer day. We tend to peak in the late afternoon, and it continues from 4 to 6 or 8 p.m., right? While we come home from work, run our air conditioners, the heat builds up in our houses, we turn on the stoves to do cooking. All that combines, and we have what's called a peak, a system peak in the late afternoon, and especially around the middle of August. But lately, it seems like the middle of August is like 100 days long. But anyway, so we have a bit of a technology mismatch where the best and most cost-effective way to get to renewables is from wind, but it doesn't blow exactly at the right time we need it. And by the way, it doesn't blow sort of. It's not on all the time. And a lot of people use that as an argument for saying that therefore we should give up on renewable resources and that we should only build coal plants and nuclear power plants because we can turn those on anytime we want. In fact, they're so expensive that you should turn them on and leave them on because starting them up is really expensive. And that was sort of the bargain that we had in the utility business before. And everybody said it would be solved if only something better came along. And some of us are saying, well, what about solar? Solar energy, solar panels on your roof, are an extremely effective way to match demand and peak. You know, the more the sun shines, the more the solar panels make electricity. Wow, that seems to track pretty well with the thing that creates the air conditioning demand. But we've got a price problem. In spite of the efforts that we've made in solar technology, they're not quite there. Now, what's interesting is every expert I've been able to look at in the last 2 or 3 years all seems to agree that solar is going to be, whatever this means, cost effective as soon as by the end of this decade. But of course, we're going to get all the shale gas we want by the end of this decade as well. So, you know, there's still some work to be done, right? So right now, getting to work to help solar happen is something my group is proud to do. We manage some incentives and some other mechanisms. We run a municipal solar energy program. We're doing everything we can to get a lot of solar around here because we know the more we use, the more we drive down the cost of the technology for future generations. So taken in responsible doses, an investment in solar today means solar for our children in the future or grandchildren in the future. But it's not quite there yet. So it's a good solution, potentially, if we stay the course, but we got to get there. The other big thing that everybody says will solve all our problems is storage. Because unlike sort of computers and unlike petroleum, where theoretically you can store it and then use it when you need to, electricity has always been seen pretty much as an on now and off then kind of situation. And it's either you can't store it cost effectively. We've all seen the cost of batteries improve over time. In small scale, storage does work. It works in our cell phones pretty well. It also works when we can match extremely efficient use to it, right? Because the more efficient the use of the electricity, the more cost-effective the storage that it's coupled with. So it favors, in terms of the technology, it favors what we would do on the energy efficiency side. But it is not, to use probably the best word, it is not ubiquitous. And it is certainly not purely cost-effective yet. Enter the electric vehicle. The electric vehicle, or the plug-in electric vehicle, sort of like Dale and Pat's, Leaf, 75 miles, completely on electricity, no gasoline propulsion whatsoever, or my Volt, which is outside, 35 miles on an electric fill-up with another 300 miles in the gasoline tank if you need it. These vehicles are essentially electric storage on wheels. They're big batteries on wheels. And if we get enough of them, and we imagine them all sitting around when they're not being driven, being plugged into the grid, then they are potentially a vastly distributed resource of electricity storage. In fact, given the way we use our vehicles, they will tend to move from our homes, which in many cases are vacant during the day, to our places of work where we are using electricity and sit there ready to be called upon for the electricity we need to meet that peak demand. And then they can be driven home where they can be plugged in while we're sending off to our personal lives such that we have left after a long day of work. So it's a pretty cool concept. And like all complex questions where someone poses a simple answer, the simple answer is usually wrong. So for now, what we face with electric vehicles are a couple of problems because we're trying to develop an emerging technology. First of all, they're pretty expensive. They certainly don't pencil out compared to a discount gasoline vehicle or the kind of vehicle they might sell you. The top seller is like a Ford truck, which is pretty cheap to get. I've had Ford trucks before, don't get me wrong. I have a truck in my driveway now. But pretty cheap to get, but kind of expensive to operate. Right? Sort of like gas plants and coal plants, right? Pretty cheap to get, but kind of expensive to operate. But so our first costs for buying all those batteries are pretty high. My Volt retails between $40,000 and $45,000 for a mid-sized 4-seater. It's a pretty expensive car. You've got to be pretty committed to what you're doing. You've got to be one of those early adopter type people. And as my poor wife Pam can attest, I've taken her through that a few times. Computers especially. The Leaf, what are you guys, $30,000? And this is before tax credit. Yeah, $35,000 before tax credit. You get that 75 miles of reliable transportation running pure, or up to 100 depending on how you run your air conditioner, all electric. So first of all, they're kind of expensive. Now here's the good news. Like solar, electric vehicles, and unlike coal plants and nuclear plants, electric vehicles, solar, computers all run according to manufacturing economies of scale. I don't want to geek out into a total economist thing, but basically, new technologies run according to either one of two kinds of general economies of scale. There's plant economies of scale. Think cathedrals and nuclear power plants. The idea being that the bigger you build them, the cheaper they get, right? Until you try to build it so big that you can't afford it. But the plant economies of scale say bigger is better. That's the whole idea of the mass production, the production line, all that sort of stuff. But manufacturing economies of scale say the more you make of them, the cheaper they get. And we've all lived through that with cell phones and computers and other things that are manufactured. Solar and electric vehicles and electric vehicle batteries in particular are driven by manufacturing economies of scale. So the good news on the cost of electric vehicles is that it will go down if we use it. It's also the bad news is if we don't, it won't. So it's sort of no help to us that these early technologies get, loudly criticized and lambasted when they fail, as early technologies often do, because some people sort of back away from it. What we actually need to do is drive through those early hurdles, like we did with computers, and we will get to ubiquitous, cost-effective technology. So that's good news. The bad news, good news, right? Bad news are expensive. Good news, the more we use, the cheaper they get. There's an even bigger bad news problem with electric vehicles as far as I'm concerned as part of the utility. And that is that, not Dale, because they've invested in a lot of energy efficiency and solar and stuff at their house, but for the ordinary consumer, if they drive their electric vehicle home and they plug it into what's called a level 2 charger, and say they get home at 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, they will immediately and effectively double the consumption of their house in terms of electricity. So if they come home and just do like I do, kind of blindly plug it into the charger so that you don't have to remember to plug it in later on. And if there's no smart technology, smart grid technology or smart control technology to keep it from doing what it naturally wants to do, the house has now effectively doubled its electricity consumption. And I have a cute graph, if you can imagine it. It goes like that. Okay, that's one of those PowerPoints I was going to show you. Again, like that. Okay, that's the electricity consumption doubling when you plug in your electric charger. And if it's a high-speed electric charger, a level 2 charger that uses a 240 connection, like ours, which tries to pack that charging into 4 hours, 3 hours, which is usually my recharge time, then it's even worse because you're taking even more energy at that same time. Mine draws 3.3 kilowatts when it's running. And like I say, that's about the same as my air conditioner's draw. So I double the use in my house. That's a big problem because we're just adding to the peak, right? It's a big problem because we're adding to the pollution, because we're making those peak power plants have to run even harder. So bad news, dumb electric vehicle charging will add a huge burden to the system. And by the way, since early adopters are likely to be more wealthy than mass users, it will also mean that richer people, not that we're rich, but richer people will be imposing excessive burdens on the system that everybody else will have to pay until the time when electric vehicles are cheap enough that everybody can afford them. So it's sort of it's a gap widening impact as well. Because not only do they get the advantage of the new technology, but they impose the cost of the inefficiency of the new technology. So dumb charging is intolerable. We cannot have it as a solution. We've got to fix it. We've got to have smarter charging. So what are we going to do? And wait, let me stop. First of all, what's the promise? Why would we even go through this problem? Why would we be early adopters in this stuff? Well, first of all, we're about to go into non-attainment for ozone in the city of Austin. And anybody who's ever lived in Houston knows that being in a non-attainment zone for air pollution quality adds huge amounts of money to what the community has to spend. It makes everything more expensive. It effectively adds a tax, if you will, to a lot of the things we do. And it requires a lot of bureaucratic planning and a lot of monitoring and oversight, et cetera, et cetera. So adding to the peak of electricity demand with dumb charging would be a problem, but the thing we're playing for, electric vehicles that don't use petroleum and contribute to ozone pollution, is worth chasing. In fact, another graph, pollution if you have petroleum, way up there. Pollution if you're running an electric vehicle, way down there. Right? Because you're transitioning from direct pollution of petroleum out of your tailpipe to using electricity, which under virtually every scenario reduces the pollution. Even in Texas, where about 55% of our electricity comes from coal plants. It's still better for the environment, and it's much better, it's quantum leaps better for the local environment to be driving an electric vehicle than to be driving a petroleum vehicle. So that's worth playing for if we can solve this other problem. Avoid local air pollution and that peak dumb charging. Transition off of petroleum. And customers save money. It cost me about, I looked at it the other day on my ChargePoint site, and it cost me about $1.20 to fill up my Volt. I get the 30-some miles on it, so that's about 1/3 of what it would cost me to buy a gallon of regular gas. Volts need premium, so it's even better deal than that. So we'd actually save money that way as well. Save money, less pollution, but we have these problems. So what are we going to do with the problems? And now we kind of get into the thought process. So here's the utility, here's me, wanting to do more electric vehicles, want to encourage that. How do I solve this peak problem? Well, obviously I've got several options in front of me, and like I said, the simple choices are usually not the right ones. And the hint that it's on the slide says hint, no one is sufficient. We'll use a combination of these approaches. But sort of to get you up to speed with some of the things you might be hearing about in the media or hear about from people as they talk about it, just to make you think about how we think through this problem, I want to go through some of those options. I've already talked about a few of them. But the first one, and the one that always comes out from the neoclassical economists, is, well, we just need to charge the right price for electricity. You'll hear it, like, we need to charge a high peak price for electricity, and if we charge the high peak price for electricity, then those people would not plug their electric vehicles in and use it when electricity system was at its peak. Here's the problem with that. If I was price sensitive, would I have spent $45,000 on a Volt? I mean, really, you know, the early adopters are not sitting there worried about incremental charges on their electricity. So that's one thing that's kind of dumb, right? I'm not a price-sensitive consumer of personal transportation. I'm trying to buy a statement and a lifestyle commitment as much as personal sort of economic benefit. But also, it's highly punitive. I mean, there's a lot of people in our community who can't afford to dodge that high peak price. The only time they have to make the dinner, do the clothes, oversee the homework, and otherwise gets their homes in shape is the time when they come home between job number 1 and job number 2. It's part of what drives that peak. So trying to punish a non-price sensitive early adopter electric vehicle owner with a high price and with a rate that also impacts everyone else has a potential of being highly regressive. And that's not necessarily a good policy position for the utility. So that's not necessarily a fix in and of itself, although price signals can help. One of the really exciting ideas, but it's a little ahead of its time, is solar. Again, a solar system on a house that does electric charging. You could plug your car in and basically it's coming onto the system just at the same time that the solar is peaking, and maybe you get pretty close to a wash, right? So that helps. It contributes to the problem. Or solving the problem, that is. But if you've got all this great, valuable solar peaking, solar energy, wouldn't it be great if that was contributing to the rest of the system? So we still would like to get the cars off of it, but at least we can blunt the effect because some of these early adopters also have the wherewithal and the willingness to invest in solar. So we ought to look at tying them together where we can. It makes sense. We should encourage that, maybe with higher rates, right? But it's not a complete and total solution. Another great option that you'll hear people say is, well, let's just put in stationary storage, right? Another battery that sits in your garage. And we can charge it up whenever we want to, and then when you come home from work, you plug your car into that. And you quickly recharge your car, and then later on the stationary storage device plugs in. That's a pretty cool idea, but it's probably going to be the best idea once the batteries in our cars now reach about 8 years. Because when they're about 8 years old, they drop down to about 80% of performance, which is too low to keep them in the car. But they'd still be perfectly good. It's kind of think of them like a beer fridge, which you should not have, by the way. which you should not have. If you have one, we'll give you $50 to get rid of it. But think of it like a beer battery, right? It's in the garage, and then we don't care. We can control its timing of charging. And that's a pretty cool and elegant solution, but there's kind of some economic problems. Basic fact of personal transportation is that 95% of the time you're not using it, right? And the basic fact of personal transportation today, sadly also, and the reason why petroleum sort of cars is a bad idea, is about 95% of the energy goes to moving the car and not you. Right? So from a mobility solution, individual cars has never been a really good idea. So you've got to deal with those kind of economics when you've got the car with the battery. Imagine a stationary battery that's used even less, that has even less value attached to it. So it wouldn't make any economic sense to develop new batteries today to act as, garage batteries for your electric vehicle. But in 8 years, I want to buy a few of them. I want to see if they can't be reconditioned to 100% performance. I want to buy a few and put them in some garages and see how that works. But here's a really cool idea that does have great promise today. Workplace electric vehicle charging. In two modes. First, a public charging network, which has double benefits. I'll talk about those in a second. But second, in workplace garages, where people could come plug their car in and take electricity during the day and then go home with their car refilled. Here's why that's interesting. One of the biggest challenges in people buying electric vehicles today is something they call range anxiety. You may have felt it if you've thought about electric vehicles. It's like, well, what if I don't have enough gas, if you will, juice in the tank? Will I be able to top off? For that reason, Austin is one of the first cities in the country to have a public charging network in place. We've got 70 on our way to over 100 charging stations in place that everybody can use. For $25, you can have 6 months all you can eat charging from one of those the public charging stations. You can keep your electric vehicle charged up. We're not going to make a lot of money on them because, to be honest with you, most people don't want to use those charging stations. They just want to know they're there. It's sort of like the early days of diesel in cars. You just wanted to know, does the average gas station have one, or do I have to drive to the edge of the city and go to a truck stop? Once we started seeing those green pumps appear, people got more comfortable with diesel-powered personal vehicles. We have the same feeling about charging stations. Also, by the way, with a 110 plug, they power electric bicycles and scooters, too. So that's kind of cool. Part of our citywide electrification of transportation initiative. But we can get after that range anxiety with the first place, just the public charging network. And we can make those possible for people that come to downtown because maybe they can stop. If they're doing business at City Hall, they can use the charging station there. If they're doing business at our offices, they can use the charging station there. And that kind of helps. But the second part is really exciting. Because if I put it in the garage where you park your car for work, like I said, you get 100% filled up. Then when you go home, you only use sort of half your round trip. So you still have a fair amount of juice in your car. And at that time, maybe that higher peak price will work to drive you from charging it. Maybe you'll delay your charging. And by the way, my Volt has an adjustment. I can delay the charging till midnight. Just preset it, and that's what happens every time. Or I can put in some circuitry to control that, which is what the utility is working on developing, communicating and sensing it. But we can relieve a lot of that range anxiety if we leave you with a few miles in your tank, if you will. And we do a dramatic thing to the number of people who can reasonably use electric vehicles and go to work. Today, you can make it from, say, downtown to about the Arboretum and back on a volt charge of 35 miles. You can make it to the Y and back. You can make it to Buda and back on a one fill-up of a volt. But if I top you off at work, I can get you all the way to Lampasas, all the way up to Georgetown. And all those people who commute to our city to work can now think about something like a 35-mile round-trip tank, like my Volt, as a reasonable option for transportation. And of course, if you did the same math with a Leaf, which goes 75 miles, you virtually get anybody who comes to work to Austin, if you could just top them off at work. But here's the really cool thing about taking this sort of systems perspective and thinking about how it all fits together. If I deploy the infrastructure today for all this workplace charging and public charging, then when your car is sitting there plugged in and when your range anxiety starts to fade, because we know over time people will stop trying to always keep their batteries full, and they'll realize, yeah, half full means I can get where I need to go, or whatever. We know that they'll start being open to the idea of selling some electricity to us. And then we have the emergence of a true smart grid with two-way capability and storage on the hoof plugged in all over our city that the utility can access to avoid running polluting power plants. Because then I can have your car come in, and if it's like my Volt, it comes in, it's sitting around 20 miles when it gets to the office. We could top it off in the morning time, but maybe say around 11 when we start turning on the gas plants to meet the day's peak, we can use the power in the electric vehicles to ease that demand on the grid so the power plants have more time to warm up so their pollution that's really high when the plants are first coming on, because the machines aren't up to optimal running temperature, we can slow that down and ease that pollution and avoid that spike. Maybe we can then top them off around the lunchtime period, those cars, and then maybe take a little bit in the early afternoon peak. Draw some down from the car. Make sure they've got at least enough mileage to get home, whatever the customer says they want, and then send them home. Send them home and eventually to that stationary storage, and then fill them up at night when that wind starts to blow at 2 a.m. So suddenly we've got the opportunity to shift most of our electric system to wind cheaply today by moving, essentially air conditioning our houses at 2 a.m. by buying the electricity then, putting it into our cars, and then feeding it into the system to run the air conditioner. Essentially it's wind energy air conditioning your house during the afternoon. Easing that demand with solar, which comes on about the same time. Coming up with smart technologies that enable us to not just communicate between the utility and the cars, but the utility and the car and the air conditioner. So that just, for example, when I do come home, my air conditioner sends a simple signal to my car that says, please don't charge, I'm fixing to run. And it says, I'm finished running, you can start charging again. Which we can do. Hopefully, I'll have the team from the Street working on pretty soon. So now we get to our council goals of a much higher percentage of efficiency, of renewables and efficiency. We displace local pollution. We encourage new infrastructure. We engage customers in the active management of their electricity in a simple way. And we make our city a better, cooler place to live. With lots of pictures. That was my talk. I think our efforts in the way to sort of sustainability and and more electric transportation pay off in other ways as well. Real quickly, first of all, taking a leadership position as we did under Roger Duncan's leadership a few years ago, put us on the map and got us millions of dollars in federal funds that we could use to launch this infrastructure. All our public charging stations are essentially free from the federal government, which means it's free from us. But isn't that a good thing for us to invest in? Because we were leaders. We got more money to do regional planning so that we can do electric vehicle readiness from Georgetown down to San Antonio and everywhere in between, and up to the sides a little bit as well. We're getting the benefit of companies who are interested, hiring people, working in the area. That's a good benefit as well. It's driving the smart technology and smart grid phenomenon that will enable us to accomplish our other goals. And it makes us better partners communicating with our customers because we need to know how you use electricity and we need to work together on everybody using it more efficiently. For that reason, today, if you want to get an electric vehicle, we'll offer you up to $1,500 back on a charger and its installation, for up to 50% of the cost. Like I said, we have a deal where you can just get the swipe fob that just is a little mini card like you get at the grocery store. Dale's going to wave his around right now. There it is. That's how big it is. You put it in front of a charger, and you can charge, like I said, all you need for 6 months for $25. And by the way, we still make money on that. It's not going to make gobs of money, but we make money on that because electricity is cheap. Trying to think of what else we're doing to try to make this happen. We're testing out some vehicles. We have a couple of volts in my garage that we use in my group. We've got a lot of information available on the web. If you'll just go to austinenergy.com and look for electric vehicles or PEVs, you'll see all the information about our programs there. I said we've got a lot of public charging stations up. I brought a few copies of the maps if anybody's really interested in seeing where they are, as well as program descriptions if you're interested in moving along. I didn't make enough copies for everybody, but there's always the internet if you don't have me to count on to get onto the computer. So I'll stop there. Tough problems, interesting solutions, but I think we can move forward to sustainability. And do we have, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I've got a three-part question, very short.
Okay.
How do we power the plants? Once the plants are giving savings with cars, don't we still need all this oil and other coal junk to power the plants? Secondly...
The plants, which plants?
The power plants.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Secondly, related to that is we have a very poor grid system in this country. How do we solve it? How does that play into it? And thirdly, you mentioned federal stuff. How do we get Congress, which is busily passing stuff about anti-abortion laws, to really concentrate on something that's important?
I can't answer the one about Congress except for to just go to the idea that I do still fundamentally, I mean, I'm a bit of an idealist. I do still fundamentally believe that it's just plain old grassroots activism, and eventually, the cynical answer is that we have exactly the Congress we appear to want. So we need to let them know that that's not what we want. Power plants, there is Aldo Leopold once said in Thinking Like a Mountain, one of the best little essays in the world, he said we are remodeling the Alhambra with a steam shovel, and we're proud of the yardage. But he said, we will hardly relinquish the steam shovel, which after all has its uses, but we are in need in kinder, more gentler rules for its application, or something like that. So we're going to be going through a transition, just crass economics, as people who have invested in big coal-based power plants are going to want to run them through their useful life. Environmental regulations eventually will make it, not cost-effective for them to operate. Here's my personal approach is that what we need to do is we need to start learning to live without it, because someday we will have to. So we need to not wait for that day to develop these options and show that we're capable of doing more than one thing at a time. And I think that's really what Austin's doing. And then the second question was, I'm sorry. Oh yeah, the grid. Here's what's kind of cool about this, right? The solutions that I'm talking about, in my title, Distributed Energy Services. Distributed energy services are a great way to effectively compete with a large central station model, right? Solar on the roof is worth many more cents than even the average price that you pay for electricity, and worth far more than the electricity we get from those central station plants. But we had that old economies of plant scale model that says, well, nuclear power is only 2 cents. So a smart grid that responds at the watt level, or at the most the kilowatt level, is actually a much more elegant solution than working on the megawatt level and trying to send it in with big, expensive transmission lines that get congested. Partly, you also have to be smart. The new wind perches that Austin Energy is making are in the coast, which was a piece of wire that wasn't heavily used, doesn't have congestion, and coastal wind peaks closer to our system peak. So you have to be smart about it and say, well, that highway's congested, I'm going to use that highway for my electricity. But eventually this highway will get congested like all highways do. So we have to work on these other solutions in parallel. I will say that the history, as a former public utility commissioner, I can tell you that the history of transmission in the state of Texas has sort of fit perfectly with Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons story, right? I mean, and the end of Garrett Hardin's essay there is mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon, right? to prevent a few from taking advantage of what we all need in common, we must all get together and figure out the rules to limit our consumption, and also, I would say, to maximize our investment. After years and years and years of trying to get the public utility commissions under George Bush and others to finally deal with the transmission problem so that West Texas Wind could make it in, they finally had an expensive multi-year proceeding that the legislature actually had to say, damn it, we told you to fix this problem. They call it the CREZ program. And now we're going to invest some $5 billion in improving the West Texas grid. That's good for all kinds of power plants, and it's great for the rest where we live, which is sort of Dallas, San Antonio, over to Houston. But it took a lot of kind of mutual coercion, and we just have to keep driving that, because otherwise we will sort of trash the commons, We don't care much about the national grid here because we have the only non-interconnected intrastate grid, the ERCOT system. Outside of that, my friend John Wellinghoff, the chairman of the FERC, he's counting on things like electric vehicles and distributed technologies to play that same sort of effect of saying, I think I can do it cheaper here, so you're going to solve your problem or not, right? Sort of the best solution. Problems of intrastate dealing with transmission across the rest of this country they actually get constitutional real fast.
Okay.
I don't know how they work.
I've got a relatively simple question. Okay. Several years ago, Austin was very interested in the plug-in hybrids. Is that interest still there?
Yeah, that's exactly what this is all about. We like electric vehicles and electric transportation, and we had rebates for the vehicles themselves. We've transitioned to rebates for the charging stations because really that's sort of the electric infrastructure. But what he's also referring to is that, 8 years ago or something, I don't know, it's been a while, Austin championed a nationwide campaign called the Plug-in Partners. We're still using that cute logo. And it was just, we said that if we demonstrated that people wanted it, will you car makers make some? And we actually got so many sort of people saying, yes, we'll buy them if you make them, that GM announced the Volt and Nissan announced the Leaf, and we declared victory. So we transitioned the Plug-in Partners campaign, which was a national awareness campaign, into our electric, what we're calling EV Ready, the electric vehicle readiness campaign, and we now use EV to cover both plug-in and pure electric vehicles. And we want as many as we can get.
I love your idea of portable storage, but in transition, I have a timer on my water system. I have a timer on my thermostat. Why don't you just put a timer on your charger so that it doesn't start charging till the wind comes on?
Timers is a sort of very easy solution. We like it a lot. What we generally find with those kind of devices is that customers want a red button that they can push to override the timer. And they do that, and we're afraid that when it comes to transportation like this, they'll go, I can't afford to wait. I might have to go pick up Johnny from the soccer team or from soccer practice. And they'll push the dang button and push the button. So while we want to install that kind of control, and we certainly envision it, it almost as easy would be an idea like I described where it just cuts off the charging while the air conditioner is cycling so we don't have that immediate impact. It extends the charging period a bit, but allows them to start filling up, And like I said, maybe they'll be more willing to go with a timer that they don't push the red button on if we send them home with half a tank, right? So that we see these things actually, like I said, sort of the hint, we see these things all fitting together because we're trying to get to this new psychological framework about how do I use this kind of transportation. And by the way, I will tell you in case somebody wants to ask a question about the Volts, there are other things we have to learn. You may have heard about in the news that they had fires in Volts. They've had 3 fires so far in Volts. Apparently GM tested them on their proving grounds and crashed them so badly that they broke the battery cooling system. And then they moved these cars over to another piece of the lot and left them there. And 2 weeks later, the batteries that still had electricity but had no cooling caught fire. So for the love of God, if you're in a Volt accident and it breaks the cooling system, get out within 2 weeks. Please. Okay? Just do. And I use that kind of sarcastic response to say, we're just going to have sort of different expectations when we use a new technology. We need to learn to draw the battery down if the cooling system has been compromised, just like mechanics know not to weld near the gas tank if there's still gas in the tank. So the other kind of fire, by the way, is people using cheap extension cords, because these vehicles do draw. Dale and I both testify. They'll draw like 30 amps or so. It's a pretty serious charge, and if you use a cheap extension cord, you're guaranteed to get a cord fire. So that's the other problem.
Well, excellent presentation. And on the subject of batteries have been limited by basically electrochemistry for decades, and there hasn't been very much progress. I mean, we went from the old lead acid to various lithium batteries now and some other compounds. You mentioned the dramatic progress seen in the reduction of computers, and that's because of Moore's law scaling, where everything gets smaller year per year, and you double the number of transistors on chip. There's some potential of moving in that direction in batteries, too, with super batteries, and I don't know if you're familiar with these at all, but it's basically capacitor storage instead of electrochemical. And
what kind of storage?
Capacitor storage, storing electricity on a capacitance on a battery. And so the question is, have you heard about this? Have you thought about this? It seems like that could have a huge effect on things like electric vehicles.
We use capacitors and technology like that around the grid. They are great short-term, reliable outputters of power right now, but they don't have a lot of energy value, duration. So that improvement needs to be made to figure out how to sort of mitigate the flow out of a capacitor. There are, by the way, much of the reason why lithium-ion is sort of making it as well as it's making in cars now is sort of a lot of nanotechnology work. So there may be opportunities in just doing better work with some of the existing technologies, laying your substrates more uniformly, getting better interactions between the anode and cathode side so you don't get sort of, problems inside them. There's still also reason to work on things like fuel cells and, other kinds of storage, portable storage devices. I saw another company with flywheels. I don't think you'd want to put those in a car, but they might serve as that residential battery storage unit. Spin up a flywheel at 300,000 and tap the energy off of that. So I think supercaps and stuff have potential. I'm not sure if they're going to make sense for the transportation sector yet, given the pattern, the energy flow that's needed off of them, but they could all contribute if we look at it as a system. And by the way, one of the reasons why sort of electric vehicles is an interesting place to drive the storage agenda is because it's a really high value application, right? Like I described, a battery that sits idle in your house most of the time is not as interesting to even one that we would at least use twice a day to get to and from work. And personal transportation is essential. You can't make the money to pay the bills if you don't go to work. So it's high value. And we generally chase the highest value applications first. But what oftentimes is that the demand curve of the status quo is what gets layered onto the new technology. It must meet my demands for, along with that, like I said, comes some behavioral changes. But generally, you take your consumer as you find them and then change them. And that's been the challenge for the electric vehicle industry.
We have another question here. Crockett?
Yes, my question is similar to the previous person's questions. That is, you made very interesting discussions about electric vehicles, but you're always assuming the electric vehicles were going to be have external sources of recharging. And the last person's questions brought up, the questions of fuel cells and other things. And I would like to particularly ask you about fuel cells. What is because that basically provides a means of generating electricity within the car itself. And furthermore, with a fuel cell, the products that you have coming from a fuel cell are much less than those of the gasoline engine. So
let me start with, just in case everybody doesn't understand them. Fuel cells, another electrochemical kind of device. It basically takes hydrogen and oxygen, which if combined, sort of just two tanks full would explode. but it takes that reaction and it separates it by a membrane or some other mechanism and allows the hydrogen and the oxygen to, instead of sort of go to dirty dancing, they just have a nice, pleasant handshake. And they do it across the membrane, and that releases energy, and then you harvest that energy as electricity. And there's still some thermal release. So very exciting. I used to run a fuel cell lab at the Houston Advanced Research Center and had a chance to work with a lot of the proton exchange membrane fuel cells, which are the smaller ones. It's very cool. It's very cost effective to replace some battery applications like lead acid batteries at communications towers. They've gotten a lot better with the membranes so they don't clog up. They've got a lot better with the materials, a lot of nanotechnology benefits there as well. But right now they face the problem that to make a fuel cell run, essentially you have to run hydrogen and oxygen into them. Some of them will take natural gas, which means you've got to separate the C and the H and then run the H in with oxygen. And that process is called reforming, breaking something else into hydrogen and then adding it to the oxygen. And reforming technology is still, they're working hard on it. So fuel cells that can afford to run on neat hydrogen that you take from large industrial scale natural gas reforming processes and then put the hydrogen in tanks like you see on the back of trucks, very cost effective to replace lead acid batteries today. Getting to the point where we'd have hydrogen tanks on cars, or natural gas tanks on cars with onboard reformers. We still have some more development to do. And I think we'll come in through other applications first before fuel cells can actually be the thing that drives electric vehicles.
Okay. We have a question here and then hopefully one or two more.
Your scenario for getting energy from car batteries sounds very appealing. I'm worried about the cost of building the infrastructure, the smart grid, to do that. Does it take hundreds of cars to work through this scenario to make the infrastructure worth doing, or thousands, millions?
It's probably not worth it even at hundreds of cars, I mean, to a certain extent, right? Because you figure how many, there's got to be hundreds of thousands of cars here in the Austin area all by itself. You do need a critical mass of demand, and that's going to be the hard thing. We envision ourselves providing, at Austin Energy, we envision ourselves providing incentives to get over sort of that for early adopters. By the way, our latest, this is another graph, high, medium, low. Our latest projections, taking into account the economy, are the highest demand we get by 2020 is 40,000 vehicles. Our midpoint estimate is probably around 10,000 vehicles. Our low estimate is probably in the range of 8,000 to 7,000 vehicles in this area. At 40,000, we're making enough money selling electricity that we ought to invest in it, right? And in supporting that infrastructure. At 10,000, I'm still, begging for budget. But hopefully by that time, I'm also leveraging against the air pollution benefits that come from it. Because if I can get EPA and others to accept the replacement of a tailpipe of exhaust with an electric vehicle, that should count for some SIP credit, the State Implementation Plan credit for the non-attainment. But the smart grid technologies themselves, the good news is that the smart grid is not really expensive to deploy. I can get you a pretty good home energy management system with a wireless output and internal Wi-Fi Zigbee connection, probably for $1,000. Add devices to 2 or 3 of your most critical demands. It's a whole other talk, and I guarantee I'll make the computer work for that. But if you ever want me back. But here's the main deal. The main deal about the smart grid is that we tend to project, and even in conjunction with electric vehicles, we tend to project to the super duper world where, like I say sarcastically sometimes, where I'm controlling my toaster with my iPhone. But nobody wants to control their toaster with their iPhone. We can probably get about 90% of the value with like that non-controlled device like I described before, where the charger just takes a holiday every time the air conditioner cycles. That's 3.3 kW of savings, boom, right there. That'll pay for a charger real fast compared to somebody getting that charger on at the same peak time. So that's a huge amount of it. If I put the same kind of controls, we've got 100,000 air conditioners in Austin under our control, and we generate many millions of dollars in peak electricity savings for the city above what it costs us to deploy and run that technology. So a couple of simple things. Technology is all S-curved, right? I don't know if you've ever seen it, right? It's a curve that's shaped like this. And at first it's really hard to get it going. And then the advantages just go real fast with hardly any additional spending. And then you get about 90% of it, and then the last 10% costs a lot of money. We got to figure out how to drive past that first inflection point so that we get onto the high benefits for low cost piece, and that's pretty much where we are. So we got to be smart too.
Your comment centered on personal vehicles. What about fleet vehicles for electronic technology? Since they go back to the same place, have known range, and as a bicycle commuter, I get engulfed in the diesel fuel of the AIC buses every day.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm sorry. First of all, in fleet, which is sort of passenger cars, panel vans, things like that that are used, many of which from a single place, that's probably our first good target for workplace charging, right? Because, having that stuff installed. But actually, those cars are likely to fill up at night, right? Because they got to keep those vehicles out running. There's some really promising and just beautifully simple technology for the larger vehicles, essentially where you just go in there and you take the drive shaft and you just cut it, like a Coca-Cola delivery truck or some of those other things, and then you just put in a motor right there and hang batteries on either side of it underneath the frame. And just little incremental improvements like that, where it's boosted by a battery that may run out, seems to be very, very promising. You don't have to get as fancy as the Toyota Prius, which has that synergy drive where it doesn't turn the engine on up to 20 miles an hour and then it does. That's nice and it's elegant. But like I say, there's sort of even just cruder and more simple ones that just say, slap that motor in onto the drive shaft, pull off the power according to some sort of preset routine. And on the Coke truck that I saw at the Coca-Cola distributor, they were talking 50% reductions in diesel emissions. Now, that's because Coke trucks drive, stop, unload Coke, then drive on, stop. They have a pattern of usage that's like that. But 50% diesel emissions, man, bicycle behind the Coca-Cola with the electric assist. It's got to be better than the bus. The buses, by the way, are a great place for natural gas, as we've seen, and they're also really they might be a good platform for that fuel cell because they've got a big enough infrastructure they can support hydrogen tanks or even an onboard reformer. So appropriate technology for the appropriate place.
Thank you for a vision for the future. Let's give them a big hand.